He had everything money could buy: silent mansions, cars few dare to drive, and a schedule packed with exclusive commitments. Still, every night ended the same way. A man alone, surrounded by luxury, yet consumed by an emptiness no achievement could explain. The world saw him as an absolute winner, someone who had reached the top. What no one imagined was that life was about to confront him in the most unlikely place, through an encounter that would change everything. How could someone who had reached billions feel so incomplete inside? Because wealth without purpose does not fill the human heart. It only distracts it for a while. And how could a dying dog, forgotten on the side of the road, transform the destiny of such a powerful man? Because sometimes the greatest changes are not born from big decisions, but from small acts of compassion that reveal who we truly are. One morning, he left the mansion before dawn, something rare for someone accustomed to schedules controlled by assistants and commitments planned weeks in advance. The sky still carried grayish tones, and the road, cutting through a remote area outside the city, was almost empty. That route was not part of his routine. It was a secondary road, used only when he needed to think far from noise, far from people, far from expectations. The car moved smoothly as his thoughts wandered between meetings, numbers, and decisions that no longer stirred any emotion. Then something at the edge of the road caught his attention. At first, it looked like just a dark heap among dust and dry leaves. He drove on for a few seconds, but a strange uneasiness made him slow down. Something about that specific spot felt out of place. When he looked in the rearview mirror, he felt a quiet discomfort, as if he had ignored something important. Against the impulse to keep going, he stopped the car a few meters ahead and turned off the engine. The cold morning wind touched his face as he stepped out. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of birds waking up. He walked slowly back, feeling the uneven ground beneath his expensive shoes, completely out of place in that simple setting. As he got closer, he realized it was not just any object. It was a dog, too thin, too still, lying on its side, fur dirty with earth and marks that suggested days, perhaps weeks, of abandonment. For a moment, he simply observed. The dog was breathing with difficulty, its chest rising and falling irregularly. One eye was partially open, dull, as if life were slowly slipping away. There were visible wounds, some poorly healed, others still recent. That scene did not match the world he came from. It did not belong to meetings in glass-walled rooms or multi-million-dollar contracts signed without hesitation. His first impulse was to call someone, an assistant, some service, someone to deal with it quickly. He pulled out his phone, but hesitated. The lit screen reflected his own face, serious, tired. Something made him put the device back into his pocket. For the first time in a long while, he felt that delegating the situation would be a form of running away. He crouched carefully, keeping some distance. The dog barely reacted, only letting out a low sound, almost imperceptible, more like a sigh than a bark. There was no aggression, no explicit fear, only exhaustion, a deep exhaustion that seemed to go beyond the body. The billionaire felt a tightness in his chest that was hard to define. It was not ordinary pity. It was something more uncomfortable, as if he were looking at a forgotten version of himself. He thought about how many times he had passed by similar situations without noticing. How many invisible lives he had ignored, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. The world had always taught him to move forward, not to stop, not to look back. That road, however, demanded the opposite. It demanded presence. Carefully, he took off his suit jacket and draped it over the dog to protect it from a cold. The animal moved slightly, reacting to the unexpected warmth. It was a minimal movement, but enough to break something inside him. There, before that absolute fragility, there were no titles, no assets, no power. Just two beings breathing the same cold morning air. He knew time was a decisive factor. The dog's condition showed that waiting was not an option. He opened the back door of the car, moved a few items aside, and improvised a space. When he tried to lift the animal, he realized how light it was. Too light. The dog did not resist. It simply let itself be carried, as if it lacked the strength even to question. During the drive to the nearest veterinary clinic, the billionaire drove in absolute silence. He constantly checked the rearview mirror, alert to any sign of movement. The dog's weak breathing filled the car with constant tension. Every traffic light felt like a threat, every minute a risk. He had never felt that kind of urgency that did not involve money, reputation, or market power. When he arrived, he got out quickly and went inside carrying the animal in his arms. The receptionist, surprised, called the staff without asking questions. The dog was rushed away, while he stood there, feeling his hands empty for the first time in a long while. The watch on his wrist marked seconds that seemed not to move. He sat down, ran his hands over his face, and took a deep breath. There, in that simple room, surrounded by educational posters and the characteristic smell of antiseptic, something had already changed. It was not a visible transformation, nor something that could be measured. It was an internal shift, silent, initiated at the exact moment he decided to stop the car on that forgotten road. As he waited for news, he realized that the encounter had not been random. It did not feel like a common coincidence. It was as if life, tired of being ignored, had found a direct way to reach him. And now, without realizing it, he was no longer just a wealthy man following his habitual path. He had gotten involved, and that, in itself, had already changed everything. He believed his decision had been too simple to deserve attention. Stopping the car, getting out, picking up an injured dog, and taking it to a clinic. In anyone's eyes, it was nothing more than a quick, almost automatic gesture, something anyone could have done. Still, as he waited in the white, silent veterinary room, he realized his body remained tense, as if he were facing something far greater than it appeared. The phone vibrated in his pocket several times. Messages from executives, meeting reminders, notifications of postponed commitments. He did not respond. For the first time in years, the corporate world felt distant, irrelevant in that moment. His gaze remained fixed on the door, separating the waiting room from the improvised surgical area where the dog fought to stay alive. Every second there carried a strange weight, unlike any multi-million-dollar negotiation he had ever faced. A veterinarian approached, explaining cautiously that the animal's condition was critical. Severe dehydration, untreated infections, clear signs of prolonged neglect. The chances were uncertain. There were possible procedures, but they would require time, care, and resources. He listened in silence, merely nodding. When she asked if he wished to authorize full treatment, there was no hesitation. His answer came firm, almost instinctive, as if that choice had been made even before the question existed. While the professionals returned to work, he remained there, alone with his thoughts. He recalled how many decisions throughout his life had been celebrated as grand. Mergers, acquisitions, bold investments, all coldly analyzed, calculated with precision. This one, however, had not followed spreadsheets or projections. There was no financial return involved, no strategic advantage, just the silent refusal to turn away. And that was precisely what unsettled him. The realization that for years he had ignored small choices like that, believing they held no real importance. Always focused on the next goal, the next number, the next achievement. That dog, abandoned to its fate, had made visible something he had avoided facing. How many times he had chosen to move on without looking to the sides. Hours passed. The clinic's atmosphere changed as the day advanced. People came and went with their animals, some relieved, others anxious. He remained there, motionless, as if that place had become the center of something he did not yet fully understand. At a certain point, the veterinarian returned. The dog had survived the initial procedure. It was not out of danger yet, but it had responded better than expected. The news did not come with euphoria. It came with a contained, deep relief, something that settled quietly in his chest. He thanked her, ran a hand over his face, and slowly exhaled. He did not realize it, but in that moment he was no longer the same man who had entered there hours earlier. The decision that had seemed small had created a crack in his old way of seeing the world. In the days that followed, he returned to the clinic repeatedly, Whenever he could, he found time between commitments to check on the dog's condition. He observed it from a distance, still weak, connected to machines, sleeping most of the time. Even so, there were signs of improvement. Small movements, more stable breathing. Each minimal advance triggered in him an unexpected sense of responsibility. He began to question the very idea of insignificance. Were small decisions truly small, or merely underestimated because they did not generate immediate recognition? That specific choice would not make headlines or earn public applause. No one would know. And perhaps that was exactly what made it different from everything he had done before. One night, upon returning home, he noticed how the silence of the mansion had transformed. It was no longer just an absence of noise, but a space filled with thoughts he had previously avoided. He walked through the wide corridors, past expensive artworks, impeccable furniture, objects symbolizing success. For the first time, all of it felt distant from who he truly was at that moment. He realized that the dog still had no name. That bothered him more than he expected. Naming something meant acknowledging existence, creating a bond. Until then, he had kept a certain emotional distance, perhaps out of fear of getting too involved. Still, the simple idea of leaving it without identity felt wrong. He decided that when the time was right, he would choose a name, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Reflecting on this, he realized that the initial decision, stopping the car, had opened a sequence of other equally silent decisions. Returning to the clinic, authorizing treatments, changing schedules, prioritizing something that offered nothing in return except the experience of caring. Each of them pulled him a little further away from the man he believed himself to be. Without realizing it, he was beginning to understand that some choices are not measured by immediate impact, but by the direction they imprint on life. That secondary road, that quick gesture, that dog on the brink of death had created an unexpected curve in his path. And even without knowing where it would lead him, there was something different now. He no longer felt the urge to accelerate and move on without looking. The decision that had seemed insignificant continued to expand, silently, within him. And for the first time in a long while, he was willing to follow that movement, without trying to control it, without reducing its value. Simply remaining present, choice after choice, step by step. The following days were marked by a waiting that seemed to distort time. Every call from the clinic made the billionaire's heart race in a way he did not recognize. It was not the kind of tension that came with strategies or calculations. It was a raw, silent fear that arose from the real possibility of loss. The dog remained in a delicate condition, oscillating between small improvements and unexpected setbacks. The veterinary team spoke carefully, choosing words that promised nothing beyond constant vigilance. He began to organize his routine around these updates. Meetings were shortened, trips postponed, commitments delegated to others. Whenever he could, he drove to the clinic and stayed there, sitting, observing the movement. He learned to recognize the sounds of the equipment, the rhythm of footsteps in the hallway, the way veterinarians approached when there was any significant change. Every detail had become important. Inside the treatment room, the dog fought silently. The fragile body responded slowly to medication, as if each heartbeat were a difficult choice. There were moments when his breathing weakened, forcing the professionals to intervene quickly. At other times, a slight movement of the paws or the opening of his eyes indicated there was still enough strength to continue. These small signs kept everyone in a constant state of alert. The billionaire observed from a distance, respecting the limits set by the team. Even so, he felt present in an intense way. He had never followed anyone so closely in such an unequal battle. It awakened old memories from times when he too had felt fragile, dependent on decisions made by others. Memories he believed he had buried under years of success and self-sufficiency. One dawn, he received a call that made him get out of bed without thinking twice. The dog's condition had worsened. An infection had reacted unexpectedly, and the next hours would be decisive. He arrived at the clinic with a tense face, attentive eyes, as if he could somehow influence the outcome just by being there. He sat again in the waiting room, now almost empty, illuminated by cold lights that offered no comfort at all. While he waited, he realized how much that situation had changed him. Before, the idea of losing something that did not belong to him would not have caused such an impact. Now, the mere possibility that the dog might not survive left him ungrounded. Not because he felt guilt, but because he had created a bond that did not depend on ownership. It was a connection based on the daily choice to care. The hours passed slowly. At certain moments, he closed his eyes, trying to control his breathing. At others, he walked back and forth, unable to remain seated. When the door finally opened, the veterinarian approached with a tired expression. The procedure had been difficult. The dog had resisted, but remained in critical condition. The next 24 hours would be decisive. He thanked her, his voice low, and sat down again. There was nothing more to do but wait. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely powerless. There was no influence, money, or connections that could speed up that process. Life followed its own rhythm, indifferent to the status of those waiting outside. At dawn, they allowed him to get closer for a few minutes. The dog was lying down, wrapped in blankets, with devices monitoring vital signs. His chest rose and fell weakly, but steadily. He approached slowly, without touching, just observing. That small body concentrated an immense struggle, invisible to the eyes of those who hurried past on the street. He realized he was truly hoping, not out of pride, nor obligation, but hope. Something simple, almost forgotten in his life. Hope that that existence, so easily discarded, could continue. Hope that his decision had been made in time. As he left the room, he felt a deep fatigue, different from any professional exhaustion he had ever experienced. It was an emotional weariness that nevertheless brought clarity. He was beginning to understand that life did not organize itself in straight lines, nor obey rigid schedules. Sometimes, everything came down to holding on a little longer. Throughout that day, he received new updates, small victories. The infection seemed to be responding better to treatment. Breathing was more stable. The body was beginning to react. Nothing definitive, but enough to keep vigilance active. Each message provoked a contained relief, followed by a new cycle of apprehension. At night, sitting alone at home, he reflected on how many times he had treated challenges as obstacles to be overcome quickly. That struggle, however, demanded patience. It demanded continuous presence, even without guarantees. And somehow, that brought him closer to the dog than any direct interaction could have. When the third day arrived, the veterinarian greeted him with a slight, tired smile. The dog had gone through the night without serious complications. It was still too early for predictions, but there was something different, an unexpected resilience. He listened attentively, absorbing every detail, as if those words were a map to an unknown territory. At that moment, he realized that he was not just following the struggle between life and death of an animal. He was, without realizing it, confronting the rigidity he had built over the years. That period of uncertainty placed him before a simple truth. Some battles are not won with control, but with surrender. As he left the clinic once again, he felt that something inside him remained suspended. There was no guarantee of victory, nor promise of full recovery. Still, there was movement, and that was enough to continue. The struggle went on, silent, intense, shared between a fragile dog and a man who, for the first time, accepted not having all the answers. As the dog's condition began to stabilize, new information emerged, revealing fragments of a story that no one had told until then. During one of the visits to the clinic, the veterinarian commented on the old scars spread across the animal's body. They were not recent marks nor common accidents. They were signs of something repeated, of a pattern of pain that had extended for a long time. The billionaire listened in silence, feeling a growing weight in his chest as each detail was carefully explained. Some wounds had healed irregularly, indicating they had never received proper treatment. Others showed signs of impact, as if the dog had been struck more than once. There were also marks on the neck, compatible with chains tightened for long periods. The veterinarian spoke without dramatizing, accustomed to seeing difficult stories, but there was evident respect in her voice. That fragile body carried a past that could no longer be ignored. The billionaire began to look at the dog differently. Before, he saw only the present struggle, the fragility of the now. Now he began to see the accumulated time in every protruding bone, in every tired look. He imagined days of hunger, cold nights, moments of silent fear. He imagined doors closing, people passing without stopping, harsh voices, impatient hands. None of this was confirmed, but everything seemed possible in the face of those marks. In a longer conversation, the team explained that the dog had probably lived chained or isolated. The lack of socialization, the withdrawn emotional state, and the absence of aggressive reactions indicated extreme submission. He was not a naturally gentle animal. He was an animal that had learned that resisting brought consequences. That realization hit the billionaire unexpectedly. He recognized that behavior, not in the body, but in the mind. Years earlier, he too had learned to mold himself to what was demanded in order to survive in a hostile environment. The more he listened, the more he realized that the dog was not only physically ill. There was an emotional exhaustion difficult to measure. Even in moments when he was awake, his eyes remained alert, as if expecting something bad to happen at any instant. There was no curiosity, only vigilance. The billionaire began to stay longer nearby, even without touching, simply offering constant presence without demands. One day, when he was allowed to get a little closer, the veterinarian commented that the dog reacted differently when he was around. The heart rate remained more stable, breathing less irregular. Nothing extraordinary, but noticeable. He heard that with surprise. He had never been a point of support for anyone in that way. The idea that his mere presence could transmit security to someone left him silent for long minutes. As days passed, small reactions began to appear. A slight movement of the head when he spoke in a low tone. A slower blink, less defensive. Minimal signs, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. Each one seemed to carry a profound meaning. It was not gratitude, it was recognition, as if the dog were slowly understanding that this environment would not repeat the past he carried in his body. The billionaire began to reflect on how many similar stories existed outside the clinic walls. Lives marked by experiences no one took the trouble to know. He himself had built an impeccable image for the world, hiding old insecurities beneath layers of success. Seeing that dog, exposed in his fragility, made him face truths he had always avoided. The team suspected that the dog had been abandoned after falling ill, when he was no longer useful to guard, protect, or obey. A life discarded at the moment it began to require care. That possibility revolted him silently, not out of direct anger, but because he recognized a cruel pattern that also existed in the world he knew so well. People valued while they produced, forgotten when they failed. On a quieter afternoon, they allowed him to touch the dog lightly for the first time. His hand approached slowly, respecting every reaction. The animal stiffened for a moment, then relaxed minimally. There was no retreat, no aggression, only cautious acceptance. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to confirm something he already felt. That past still lived there, shaping every response. He left the clinic that day with the feeling of carrying a responsibility that went beyond physical recovery. It was not enough to keep the dog alive. It was necessary to offer something different from what he had known until then. A space where he did not need to be alert all the time, where touch did not mean pain, where silence was not a threat. When he returned home, he looked again at the large, empty mansion. For the first time, he did not see it as a symbol of achievement, but as an underused space, a place that could house more than expensive objects and silent corridors. He thought of the dog there, walking carefully, exploring little by little, learning new sounds, new smells. The idea did not seem absurd. It seemed necessary. In the following days, he began to talk more with the team about long-term care. Proper nutrition, behavioral follow-up, time for adaptation. Every detail was absorbed with attention. He was not just listening, he was preparing, not to possess, but to welcome. The dog's hidden past, made it clear that recovery would not be immediate nor simple. There would be slow advances, setbacks, moments of insecurity. Still, there was something new there, an opportunity that arose not from chance, but from the continuous choice to remain. As he watched the dog sleep, breathing more calmly, the billionaire understood that some stories do not ask for complete explanations. They ask for presence. And for the first time, he was willing to offer exactly that, without haste, without expectation, simply moving forward with genuine attention. Recovery did not happen quickly nor predictably. Each advance came accompanied by caution, as if the dog's body and mind needed to confirm, day after day, that this new reality hid no traps. The first days after stabilization were dedicated to small gestures, controlled feeding, medications at the right times, respected silence. The billionaire began to visit the clinic almost daily, not out of obligation, but out of a silent need to follow every detail. The dog began to spend more time awake. He still remained motionless most of the time, but his eyes no longer had the same distant look. They observed the environment attentively, followed movements, recognized sounds. When the billionaire entered the room, there was no immediate reaction, but the body seemed less tense. Breathing remained more regular. It was a kind of discreet recognition built without haste. The veterinary team explained that emotional recovery would be just as important as physical recovery. Prolonged traumas do not disappear with basic care. They require constancy. They require predictability. The billionaire listened to every guideline attentively, mentally noting everything he would need to adapt in his own life. For the first time, his days began to organize themselves around someone other than himself. When the dog finally received partial discharge, allowing longer periods outside intense observation, the question of the next step arose. He did not hesitate. He prepared the house to receive him temporarily, following all recommendations. A quiet space, away from excessive noise, without constant circulation of people. The mansion, once marked by empty silence, began to be reorganized with another purpose. The first day at home was marked by mutual strangeness. The dog entered with short, cautious steps, sniffing every corner as if mentally registering possible escape routes. The billionaire kept his distance, sitting on the floor in a visible spot, without trying to interact. He simply remained there, present, allowing time to do its work. The hours passed slowly. The dog explored little by little, always returning to the same point, as if testing the limits of that new territory. There was no hurry. There were no commands. Only silent coexistence. At a certain moment, the animal laid down a few meters away and closed his eyes for a few seconds. It was the first time he slept outside the clinic without signs of constant alertness. The following days followed a similar rhythm. Meals at the same time. Short walks through the garden, always along the same path. The billionaire adjusted his schedule to be present during those moments. He canceled appointments, declined invitations, something unthinkable months earlier. He did not miss them. The simple routine felt more concrete than any social event. Little by little, the dog began to show curiosity. He approached a few steps closer. He watched the billionaire while he worked in silence. He sat nearby, without direct contact, simply sharing the space. There was no demand for affection. The bond was born in the absence of pressure. One morning, as he sat on the floor as usual, the billionaire noticed that the dog approached more than he normally did. He stopped beside him, hesitated for a few seconds, and carefully leaned his body lightly against the billionaire's leg. The contact lasted only briefly, but it was enough to alter something deep within. He did not move. He did not react. He simply remained there, respecting the choice behind that gesture. From that day on, small changes began to accumulate. The dog started to accept touch for longer periods. His gaze no longer avoided eye contact. His body, once rigid, began to relax at certain moments. The billionaire, in turn, began to notice internal transformations. His mind slowed down when he was there. Worries lost their intensity. Silence stopped being empty and became something shared. He decided to give the dog a name. A simple name, chosen without haste, after observing him for days. When he pronounced it for the first time, in a low voice, he noticed the animal reacted, not with enthusiasm, but with attention, as if that word began to represent something safe. The constant repetition reinforced that invisible bond, strengthening the trust that had been built slowly. The walks became longer. The dog still startled at sudden sounds, but recovered more quickly. He looked to the billionaire for reference, as if silently asking whether everything was all right. He responded with presence, maintaining the pace without rushing. Each walk became an exercise in mutual trust. As the weeks passed, the billionaire realized that the bond had not emerged from a specific event, but from the repetition of simple choices. Being there, returning the next day, remaining calm, respecting limits. He recognized in that process something he had never learned in his professional life. True relationships are not built through control, but through consistency. The dog, now stronger, began to show personality traits that had previously been hidden. A shy interest in toys, a discreet wag of the tail when seeing him arrive. Small signs that revealed an identity that had been suppressed for so long. Each discovery was received with genuine attention, without expectation of reward. On a quiet night, while the dog slept near the sofa, the billionaire observed the scene with a new sensation. It was not pride, nor satisfaction. It was belonging, a kind of connection that did not depend on words or promises, only on coexistence built day after day. Recovery continued at its own pace, without absolute guarantees. There were still challenges, insecurities, moments of regression. Even so, something essential had already been established. A bond born of patience, presence, and a conscious choice to care. And in that shared space, both of them learned, silently, that some healings happen when someone decides to stay. The changes did not arrive abruptly or with announcement. They infiltrated the billionaire's daily life with the same discretion with which the dog had begun to occupy space in his home. Nothing seemed radical at first glance, but upon closer observation, it was impossible to deny that something essential was reorganizing within him. His days no longer began with the same automatic urgency. Before even looking at his phone, he walked to where the dog slept, simply to confirm that he was there, breathing calmly. This simple routine altered the internal rhythm that had accompanied him for decades. The man who once woke up thinking about numbers, deadlines, and decisions now remained silent for a few minutes, attentive to a being who demanded nothing beyond presence. He realized he no longer felt the same constant anxiety. His body responded differently. His mind, once always projected toward the future, began to anchor itself in the present. At work, changes also emerged quietly. He began to listen more and speak less. Long meetings stopped feeling like battles to be won and became spaces for genuine exchange. He noticed he no longer felt the need to dominate every conversation. He delegated with more trust, accepted rhythms different from his own. This did not diminish his authority. On the contrary, it made his decisions more conscious. Some colleagues found it strange. They asked if everything was all right, if something had happened. He responded with a brief smile, without detailed explanations. He did not feel the need to justify what he himself could not fully explain. How could he put into words the impact of watching a traumatized dog relearn how to trust? How could he translate into corporate terms the experience of slowing down without losing meaning? At home, spaces gained new meanings. The mansion ceased to be merely a symbol of achievement and became a lived-in environment. He rearranged furniture, opened curtains that had remained closed for years, allowed light to occupy areas once forgotten. The dog followed these changes with contained curiosity, exploring new corners, lying near windows, observing the world with cautious interest. The billionaire began to realize how much he had distanced himself from his own emotions throughout life, not out of coldness, but out of the need to survive in competitive environments. Feeling less had always seemed like an advantage. Now, however, watching the dog react to simple gestures with such intensity, he allowed himself to feel as well. Subtle joy, genuine concern, a form of affection not accompanied by the fear of immediate loss. He began to walk more, not only during necessary outings, but by choice. Movement helped organize his thoughts. He observed ordinary people on the streets, something he had rarely done before. He saw hurried workers, elderly people walking slowly, distracted children. For the first time, he did not feel separate from that flow. He felt part of it, even while occupying a different place. Nights changed too. Silence was no longer oppressive. It became a comfortable space, filled with nearby breathing, soft footsteps in the hallway, a constant presence that demanded no performance. He realized he slept better, woke up less tired. His body responded positively to that new emotional configuration. At times, old memories surfaced without warning. Episodes from childhood, periods when he too had needed to adapt quickly, suppress needs, learn not to depend on anyone. He now recognized that the dog, with his past marked by control and abandonment, awakened internal echoes he had never faced clearly. There was no explicit pain in those memories, but there was recognition. The billionaire began to question what had truly motivated him over the years. Not ambition itself, but the constant search for security, control, validation. He realized that many of his efforts had been attempts to avoid vulnerability. And, ironically, it was precisely in the vulnerability of that dog that he found a new strength. He did not talk about this with anyone. He did not turn the experience into a speech or a public project. Everything happened internally, at the silent pace he had learned to respect. Some changes do not ask for an audience. They ask for continuity. One afternoon, returning from a particularly long day, he sat on the floor beside the dog, who approached without hesitation. He rested his head on the billionaire's leg and remained there calm. The billionaire felt a gentle tightness in his chest. Not sadness, but understanding. He no longer needed to prove anything in that moment. He did not need to be strong, efficient, or unshakable. He realized then that his heart had expanded in an almost imperceptible way. Not dramatically, but enough to alter choices, priorities, and perceptions. That transformation had not been planned. It was not listed on any life schedule. Still, it was there, solid and present. The silent changes continued to deepen, shaping a man who was beginning to understand that success is not measured only by what is achieved, but also by what one allows oneself to feel. And without seeking definitive explanations, he moved forward, learning through that coexistence that some of the greatest transformations happen when no one is watching. As time passed, the dog ceased to be merely someone in recovery inside that silent house. His presence began to assume a deeper meaning, even though it was never declared in words. The billionaire realized this gradually, through simple, almost invisible gestures. As he walked through the corridors, he no longer saw just an animal cautiously following his steps. He saw a living testimony of something he himself was going through. The dog began to occupy spaces that had once been empty, not only physically, but symbolically. He lay near the office door while the billionaire worked, as if guarding that environment once dominated solely by screens and numbers. Sometimes he lifted his head when the sound of typing stopped, attentive to any sign. He did not ask for attention, but he was always there, present, steady, real. The billionaire began to realize that the animal represented more than a rescue story. He represented the possibility of reconstruction. A being who had been discarded, hurt, and left on the margins was now slowly walking toward a different life. Not perfect, not free of scars, but dignified. That image began to merge with the way he saw himself. For years, he had believed that redemption was tied to grand public acts, visible achievements, accomplishments that could be recognized. Now, he understood that it could take on a much quieter form. It lived in daily care, in repeated patience, in a constant choice not to abandon. The dog demanded no explanations or justifications. He simply responded to what he received. There was a specific day when this realization became clearer. The billionaire received difficult news related to an old project, something that in the past would have triggered immediate irritation and harsh decisions. That afternoon, when he arrived home, he sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, in silence. The dog approached without hesitation, lay down beside him, and remained there, motionless. He did not try to distract him. He did not seek a reaction. He simply stayed. In that moment, the billionaire understood that this simple gesture carried enormous symbolic weight. The dog, who had once known only abandonment and instability, was now offering companionship in a moment of fragility. It was a silent inversion. The one who had been saved was now, in some way, sustaining the one who had rescued him. He began to see the animal as a mirror, not an exact reflection, but a constant reminder that no one is defined solely by the worst moment of their history. The dog carried scars that would never completely disappear. He still startled at certain sounds, still showed insecurity in unfamiliar environments. Even so, he moved forward. He adapted. He trusted a little more each day. That perception changed the way the billionaire dealt with his own past failures. Mistaken decisions, neglected relationships, choices made out of fear or pride. He no longer tried to erase those episodes. He began to recognize them as part of a larger process, just as the dog's scars were part of who he was now. The animal also became a visible symbol for those who frequented the house: staff, occasional visitors, business partners. Many noticed the change in the environment, even if they could not explain it exactly. The billionaire no longer seemed distant or inaccessible. There was something more human in his posture, something less rigid. And almost always, the dog was nearby, observing everything with calm attention. Some people asked about his story. The billionaire answered simply, without excessive detail. He did not feel the need to turn it into a grand narrative. The value was in the experience, not the telling. Still, each time he spoke about the dog, he realized he was also speaking about transformation, even without using that word. Over time, the dog began to move more confidently through the house and its surroundings. He walked with firmer posture, explored new paths, interacted with the world with less fear. The billionaire followed this progress with silent attention, recognizing in it a living metaphor. Recovery had not erased the past, but it had created a possible future. In moments of reflection, he realized that the animal represented a second chance granted not only to the one who had been rescued, but also to the one who had rescued him. The dog was concrete proof that different choices produce different paths, that stopping, looking, and acting can alter trajectories that once seemed fixed. Without speeches, without promises, the dog had become a symbol of everyday redemption. Not a spectacular redemption, but one built in silence, far from the spotlight. A redemption made of repetition, continuous care, real presence. Something the billionaire had never imagined seeking, much less finding, on the side of a forgotten road. And so, day after day, the dog walked beside him, not as a reminder of pain, but as a sign of possibility. A living reminder that what was broken may not return to what it once was, but can become something new, something whole in a different way. The transformation that began within him did not remain confined to the boundaries of the house. Over time, it began to manifest in choices that went beyond the intimate space and reached the world around him in a natural, almost inevitable way. The billionaire did not wake up one day determined to change everything. The changes emerged as logical extensions of what had already been transformed in silence. The first sign appeared in the way he began to look at situations he had previously ignored. During a routine drive through the city, he noticed an animal shelter that had always been there, invisible to him for years. He slowed the car, observed the place for a few seconds, and drove on. That image, however, stayed with him. He returned days later, not to announce anything, but simply to understand how it worked. He entered quietly, spoke with volunteers, listened to stories. He made no promises. He simply listened. He recognized in those accounts fragments of the past of the dog who now slept peacefully in his home. Abandonment, neglect, slow recovery, bonds built with patience. It all felt far too familiar to ignore. Without making it public, he began to help. At first in practical ways, covering specific medical costs, ensuring proper food, improving basic structures. He did not want plaques or mentions. He preferred that the impact be felt where it truly mattered. The dog accompanied him on some visits, staying close, observing as if understanding that this place was also part of his story. In the professional environment, the transformation took on more subtle contours. The billionaire began to question decisions that would once have been automatic. Projects that generated immediate profit but caused negative social impacts began to be reconsidered. He had not become naive or idealistic. He remained pragmatic, but now considered variables he once dismissed as irrelevant. Some partners found this posture strange. They questioned whether it would compromise results. He responded with data, not speeches. He showed that sustainability, care, and responsibility were not opposites of growth. Gradually, the tone of meetings changed. Decisions began to carry a different weight, less aggressive, more conscious. Within the company, internal changes began to emerge. Employee support programs were expanded. More flexible hours, attention to mental health, encouragement of volunteer projects. Nothing imposed from the top down. Everything built gradually, respecting resistance and limits. The billionaire observed these movements attentively, without haste, understanding that real transformations do not endure when forced. He realized that his own behavior served as a reference. By showing himself more accessible, more attentive, more human, he opened space for others to do the same. Conversations that once did not happen began to emerge. People felt safer speaking about difficulties, ideas, and limits. The environment became less rigid without losing efficiency. Outside of work, his presence also began to be noticed differently. Old friends commented that he seemed different, less distant, less concerned with proving something. He smiled, neither denying nor confirming. He felt no need to explain what he was living. He knew that some changes only make sense to those who experience them. The dog, always nearby, had become part of this process. His simple presence at informal meetings, discreet gatherings, or quick visits conveyed something words could not. People reacted to him with curiosity, affection, empathy, and when they learned his story, they inevitably reflected on choices, on care, on responsibility. The billionaire began to understand that the deepest impact of his transformation was not in isolated actions, but in the chain reaction they provoked. One silent gesture inspired another. One conscious decision opened space for new possibilities. Just as the dog had learned to trust again, people around him began to believe that change was possible without violent ruptures. He also began to support educational initiatives related to animal care and social responsibility, always discreetly. He did not seek recognition. He sought coherence. He wanted his external choices to reflect what had been transformed internally, not out of moral obligation, but out of alignment. In moments of reflection, he realized that this transformation beyond the personal had not been planned. It had spread organically, a direct consequence of a change in perspective. The world had not suddenly become simpler or fairer. Challenges, injustices, and limitations still existed. What had changed was his willingness not to ignore them. As he watched the dog walking confidently at his side, interacting with people, exploring environments that once would have caused panic, he saw a living metaphor for what was happening. The recovery of one being had triggered a larger movement that went beyond the relationship between two individuals. Without grand speeches or public announcements, the billionaire continued adjusting the way he was in the world. He now understood that transformation does not mean controlling outcomes, but assuming responsibility for the choices made each day. And in this ongoing process, he discovered that true influence is not born of power, but of coherence between what one feels, what one does, and what one allows to change. Legacy did not emerge as a structured plan, nor as something he intended to leave recorded. It was born silently, just like everything that had transformed since the day he stopped the car on that forgotten road. The billionaire began to realize that his choices, now more conscious, continued even when he was not present. And this made him reflect on what it truly means to leave something behind. As he watched the dog walking confidently through the house, interacting with people without the constant fear that once dominated him, he saw an invisible line connecting past, present, and future. That animal carried marks that would not disappear, but also carried a story still being built. The billionaire understood that the same applied to his own life. His legacy would not be defined only by what he accumulated, but by what he allowed to flourish. Over time, the initiatives he supported began to gain autonomy. Shelters grew stronger, teams organized themselves better, projects stopped depending exclusively on his direct intervention. This brought him an unexpected sense of calm. He did not need to be at the center for things to continue. The impact moved forward, sustained by people who believed in what they were building. Within the company, decisions made months earlier began to produce consistent results. Healthier environments generated more engaged teams. Projects designed with social responsibility expanded opportunities in communities previously ignored. The billionaire observed these developments without the need to claim credit. The value lay in continuity, not authorship. He came to understand that a true legacy does not depend on permanent control. On the contrary, it is born when something is strong enough to walk on its own. Just like the dog, now exploring the world with curiosity and autonomy. What he had helped to initiate followed its own rhythm. In occasional conversations, when someone mentioned his change in posture or asked what had motivated so many different choices, he responded simply. He spoke about stopping, looking, and acting. He did not cite grand philosophies, nor turn his experience into a formal lesson. He knew that each person would need to find their own point of inflection. The dog, always present, had become a living part of that legacy. His story was told by others, not by the billionaire. People who knew him saw in him proof that consistent care can alter destinies. Children petted him without fear. Volunteers were moved when they remembered how he had arrived. That life, once discarded, now inspired other choices. In moments of silence, the billionaire reflected on how everything had begun with something seemingly small. A gesture that did not enter reports, did not generate headlines, did not alter the financial market. Still, it had triggered a series of changes that extended beyond his own existence. This brought him a sense of humility difficult to describe. He realized that the deepest legacy he was building was not related only to external actions, but to the way he had begun to position himself before life. Less haste, more attention, less need to prove, more willingness to remain. These attitudes influenced people close to him, collaborators, partners, even without explicit speeches. As he aged, he began to think less about expansion and more about continuity, not in the sense of perpetuating his name, but of ensuring that what made sense could move forward without him. He adjusted structures, prepared people, trusted processes, all without abandoning the simplicity he had learned alongside the dog. One afternoon, sitting in the garden, watching the animal rest in the sun, the billionaire felt a rare clarity. He did not need more achievements to validate his journey. What truly mattered was already happening. That legacy would not be measured in numbers, but in lives touched, in inspired choices, in paths gently altered. He knew that one day he would no longer be there. The house would change, the companies would follow other directions, people would continue their stories. The dog, perhaps, would also leave before or after him. Still, something would remain. Not as a grand memory, but as discrete influence spread through gestures, decisions, and attitudes. The legacy born of an act of compassion did not demand recognition. It existed because someone decided to stop, look, and act when it would have been easier to move on. It existed because care was chosen repeatedly, even without guarantees. It existed because a life considered insignificant was treated as valuable. And while the dog breathed peacefully beside him, the billionaire understood that this legacy was already complete in what mattered most. Not because the story had an ending, but because it had become part of the world in a silent, steady, and real way. Time continued to move forward, as it always does, without announcements or ceremonial pauses. The billionaire no longer tried to measure his days by what he produced or conquered, but by what he lived. Mornings became calmer, nights more silent in a comfortable way. The dog, now fully integrated into that new reality, accompanied every change naturally, as if he had always belonged there. They walked together often, not out of obligation, nor by medical recommendation, but because shared movement had become part of both their lives. The dog walked with steady steps, still attentive but confident. The billionaire observed his surroundings with a gaze he had not possessed before, noticing simple details that had always been there. Trees, people, ordinary routines. Everything felt closer, more human. At times, he found himself thinking about who he would have been if he had never stopped on that road. The question arose without weight, without regret, simply as an acknowledgement that one specific choice had altered the course of many others. There was no need to dramatize it. The truth manifested in the way he lived now, not in hypotheses about the past. The dog became part of his everyday identity, not as an external symbol, but as a constant presence. He was not displayed, nor treated as an emotional trophy. He was simply someone who was there, someone with whom he shared silence, rest, and routine. Someone who did not demand idealized versions or elaborate explanations. Sometimes visitors asked how it had all begun. He answered simply. He spoke about a road, an unexpected pause, a quick decision. He did not go into details about deep feelings or internal transformations. He knew that each person would hear only what they were ready to hear. The essential was not in the account, but in the silent example. The dog aged peacefully, carrying on his body the marks of the past, and in his behavior the proof of a rebuilt life. There are still moments of insecurity, unexpected reactions, more sensitive days. The billionaire was not frustrated by this. He understood that recovery does not erase everything. It only creates space for something different to exist. On an ordinary late afternoon, sitting in the garden, he watched the dog lying nearby, breathing slowly and regularly. The sun cast long shadows, and a light wind moved the leaves around them. There were no grand thoughts in that moment, only presence, only the clear awareness of being there, whole, without haste to go anywhere else. He realized that his life had not become perfect nor free of challenges. Difficult decisions, losses, uncertainties still existed. The difference lay in how he dealt with all of it. There was less rigidity, less resistance, less fear of feeling. He no longer tried to control every outcome. He had learned that some of the most important things arise when one allows oneself to accompany rather than command. The dog lifted his head and looked in his direction, as he always did when he sensed some internal movement, even if imperceptible. The billionaire smiled slightly, not because he was especially happy, but because he felt aligned with his own life, something that had eluded him for a long time. In that moment, there was no need to close cycles or mark endings. The story continued as it always had. What had changed was the way of walking within it. One step at a time, attentive, present, without ignoring what appeared at the margins of the path. He knew that other people would continue passing along similar roads, hurried, focused, distracted. He also knew that not everyone would stop, and that was part of it. Still, the possibility existed. The possibility of choosing differently, of looking with more care, of acting when something asks for attention. The dog lay down again, comfortable, safe. The billionaire remained there for a few more minutes, feeling the gentle weight of the moment. There was no need to record, share, or explain. That was enough. And so, without announcements or grand scenes, life went on, transformed not by a single great isolated event, but by a sequence of simple choices sustained over time. Everything had begun with a small gesture, almost unnoticed. Now it was part of who he was. As the day slowly came to an end, the billionaire understood with calm clarity that some stories do not need to be concluded to be complete. They continue living silently, in every choice made with attention, in every life touched with care, in every step taken with a willingness not to pass by indifferent. If this story touched you on any level, just as that encounter changed 2 lives on that silent road. Subscribe to the channel and continue walking with us through stories that can also transform the way you see the world.